BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? In this episode, I will be doing composite sketch analyses on some of the Zodiac Killer suspects, looking at new interpretations of the Zodiac Killer's Exorcist letter, as well as discussing the New York Zodiac Killer copycat, Eddie Seda. So I would actually like to begin with the composite sketch analyses because I was talking about this on the Friday show. Every Friday I do a segment about D.B. Cooper now called Cooper Friday, and in the most recent episode I was looking at the different composite sketches of D.B. Cooper and comparing and contrasting the different suspects, looking at who was a more likely match and who was not, and I would like to do that with the Zodiac Killer, particularly with the composite sketches that were drawn after the Zodiac's final crime, the murder of Paul Stine, on October 11th of 1969. Now, this is a bit of an exercise, because with the D.B. Cooper sketches, I think that those are fairly accurate, and that at least one of them is actually going to have some strong similarities to the real D.B. Cooper. With the Zodiac Killer case, it is so much harder. It's simply more difficult, because we aren't necessarily sure that the composite sketch after the Stine murder is what the Zodiac looked like, but that's really all we have to go on, because there are some interpretations out there, such as the one that was discussed in the documentary, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, that maybe the Lake Berryessa voyeur with the dark hair and the rectangular face is more likely what the Zodiac looked like, but that is just somebody's personal interpretation of the evidence, and it's a hypothesis. The composite sketches that were made after the Stine murder were from the witnesses, Lindsay and Rebecca Robbins, who saw the Zodiac Killer leaving the vehicle where he shot and killed Paul Stine. And the Zodiac Killer was also witnessed by Donald Falk that night, Donald Falk and Eric Selms, but they did not contribute to the composite sketches. Now, the first suspect that I would like to talk about is Xenophon Anthony. Maybe I should say Xenophon Anthony. I think that's how he pronounced his name. And Xen Anthony is a suspect that I think perhaps is the strongest match to a lot of the features, not all of them. But I've said this for a very long time, that I think almost certainly Xenophon Anthony was not the Zodiac Killer, but I can see the similarities, because so many times people will be proposing a Zodiac Killer suspect, and their suspect has a very different nose shape compared to that of the composite sketch. And I actually think that Xen Anthony matches up to the nose shape, the jawline, and the hairline. And it's even possible that someone in the neighborhood actually thought that the Zodiac Killer was Xenophon Anthony, because in addition to the Robbins kids witnessing the Zodiac leaving Paul Stine's taxi, there's also the report of the child eyewitness who was 8 years old, who stated that he saw Xenophon Anthony at Paul Stine's taxi. And I was discussing this with Richard Grinnell of ZodiacCiphers.com, and he more or less said that, kind of asking it as a question, is it possible that the kid saw somebody who looked quite a lot like Xenophon Anthony, and he recognized him from the neighborhood, but it was actually the Zodiac Killer and a different person? Because I think that Xen Anthony has facial similarities. He had a very, very different body type, tall and lanky and almost a string bean-like character, and the Zodiac is described as absolutely everything to the contrary. Now, the next suspect that I would like to talk about is one that might surprise people, and I'm not sharing with you the best matches. I'm just sharing some suspects with you that are the ones that are coming to mind. And one of them is Richard Ralph Mangan. And this might surprise a lot of people, but there is a photo of Richard Ralph Mangan sitting in front of two flags. It's actually kind of three flags if you look at the one that's in the background. And he is the Zodiac Killer suspect of Ray Penrod. And believe it or not, I think that that's what the Zodiac Killer would have looked like in old age. I don't know exactly when that photo was taken. Ray Penrod has only said that it was in the early 90s. So let's see, that would have been at least 20 years after the murder of Paul Stine, which was on October 11th of 69. So we're talking at least 21 years after that. And he does resemble a lot of things. He has the face shape as well as the brow ridge and the forehead and all of those things are what I think the Zodiac Killer would look like in his older years if the Presidio Heights composite sketch is accurate. The problem with Richard Ralph Mangan as a Zodiac Killer suspect is all I know about him is his name. I'm not even 100% sure if Ray Penrod found the right person, because Ray Penrod was somebody who was going all up and down the internet, mostly on Facebook, but perhaps in other places such as Reddit, and he was talking about his Zodiac Killer suspect, Richard Ralph Mangan, saying that he was born Richard Mangan, and sometime between 1969 and 1971 he changed his name to Ralph Mangan, and Ray Penrod obtained this information from him because he met him, he knew him personally in San Quentin prison. They were in San Quentin together. And this is how he obtained this information that Richard Ralph Mangan was the Zodiac Killer, as well as committing other crimes, such as a San Rafael double homicide. And I was always just asking for more details. And some people might not think that that's a very practical thing to do, but I was trying to just get more information because I wanted to know what the full package theory was. All right, so you knew this guy and he shared this info with you. Is that it? Is that all we have to go on? Because people make up stuff a lot. The problem is, though, with Richard Ralph Mangan, I could only find somebody who was almost identical in appearance to Ralph Mangan, and he used the name Ralph Mangan, and he was in the Midwest, not in California, and the birth year that Ray Penrod had provided was different than than Ralph Mangan's obituary. And I'm calling him Richard Ralph Mangan because, again, he was born Richard Mangan and then changed his name to Ralph Mangan in Ray Penrod's theory. But no matter what, the photo of his suspect, I think, does look like what the Zodiac Killer would appear to look like in his older years. And I think that looking at Ralph Mangan as a Zodiac suspect would most likely be a dead end. I just had to note the similarities and give credit where credit is due. And on that note, there's another Zodiac Killer suspect that I think has some striking similarities to the composite sketch that doesn't get talked about extremely frequently, and his name is Joseph Paul Franklin. He is the suspect of Sam Fisher, who has several publications out there, including the Zodiac Killer Identity, and I've also interviewed Sam Fisher, and he has talked about Joseph Paul Franklin as a Zodiac Killer suspect. We have a two-part interview here on Black Box Online Radio, and we also did one interview where he was simply talking about the other crimes that were committed by Joseph Paul Franklin, such as, well, Joseph Paul Franklin was a real serial killer called the Racist Killer, and he was more or less a traveling serial killer who would roam around the country and act as a sniper. But when I first saw the photos of Joseph Paul Franklin, they were from, again, his older years. But I began to notice a lot of strong similarities to the composite sketch, particularly the hairline, again, the nose shape, and then, the jawline. And somebody even said this when I put out the Zodiac Monday episode about Joseph Paul Franklin, saying that at first they thought this was AI bringing the Zodiac sketch to life, but it turns out it's a real person. And I just want to point out the similarities. The issue with this is that the photos that have the strong resemblance to the Zodiac's composite sketch were when Joseph Paul Franklin was much older. He would have been 18 years old at the time of the Zodiac activities in 1968 and 69. So you can evaluate that for what you will. Now, this is something that I do need to address, because somebody was discussing this when I shared the AI composite sketches of the Zodiac, and there are multiple AI composites. And someone pointed out that a lot of these appear to be very old, but AI might be imperfect. It might be making certain mistakes. And that relates to the lines that are drawn on the Presidio Heights composite sketch, because the lines on the killer's face are not meant to show age, they're meant to show texture. That's what one of you guys left in the comment section on Black Box Online Radio. And I think that there really are two reasons. One would be to show texture, but also the second reason would be to fill space, so there isn't just a giant blank space on the composite sketch. And yes, texture is important and makes it look more lifelike. But when there is the colorized composite, which isn't even done with AI, partnered with the AI composites, They all appear to be somebody who is extremely old. I was even thinking about one of the AI composites where the killer looks like he would have been possibly in his 50s. And all of the witness sightings of the Zodiac killer are not of anything older than the mid-40s. To the best of our knowledge, there could be something else out there. But this is something, though, that we do have to bear in mind, that AI might be making the Zodiac look older than he actually was. Now, does that mean that he was 18 years old? I mean, that's also a bit of the stretch, because the witness descriptions really aren't talking about somebody who looks that young. After the Blue Rock Springs shooting on July 4th of 1969, the surviving witness, Mike Mageau, estimated that he could have been mid-20s to 30s, and then, as I said, after the Stein murder, the Presidio Heights incident, it really depends on who you're going to talk to, but which one of the witnesses, because Officer Falk is the one who estimated that the Zodiac might have been in his early 40s. Also talking about how he might have seen some gray hairs, as well as the odd shuffling lope, the way that the person was walking. That's more likely to be with somebody age 40 than age 20, but it is possible for people of any age to have some type of abnormality in their walk or stride, or have some type of shuffling lope depending on their life story. So there is another suspect out there that I do want to talk about, and his name is Suspect Waterson. And I don't know a lot of info about him. Was talking about him recently on the Zodiac Killer News Report, and he is one that I think has a lot of facial similarities to the composite sketch. I mean, firstly, Suspect Waterson is obviously an alias. I don't know his real name. And he just has almost an identical jawline to the Presidio Heights sketch, partnered with the protruding cheekbones that, I mean, if those are indeed what the artist was trying to create when the composite sketch was drawn out, that his cheekbones look almost identical to the way those lines are drawn on the composite sketch. But I mean, this is the only photo that I have of Suspect Waterson, and does he have some type of massive birthmark under that pilot's hat that he's wearing? It really is not fair to just say that he is a perfect match, because there could be other disqualifying factors about him based on how little info that has been revealed to the public, and also unverified information if we don't even know his real name. And there is another suspect out there that I didn't really think matched the Zodiac composites too well until somebody wrote out in the comments section when they said that this suspect has a scary resemblance to the Zodiac composite after the Presidio Heights murder, and his name is Donald Lee Buak. Donald Lee Buak is a suspect whom I don't talk about too much here on Black Box Online Radio, because I did an old Black Box recording about him in 2020, and then I did a follow-up episode later on, about 6 months after that, where I just more or less shared all of my observations, all of the ideas that I had about Donald Lee Buak, and he's the suspect of Kevin Robert Brooks, who is working on a book called The Montana Connection, because Donald Lee Buak was an inmate in Montana at Deer Lodge Prison, and when the Zodiac Killer approached Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa, he said that he was a convict from Deer Lodge, Montana, or at the very least he had spent time in Deer Lodge Prison. And what was the name of the county where Donald Lee Buak was? It was from Muscle Shoals County in Montana, Muscle Shoals County, Montana, but he spent time in Deer Lodge Prison for the 1957 murder of Otto Fawson, a sheriff's deputy, and he was released, and he's the guy that gets out of prison on December 18th of 1968, which is 2.5 days before the Lake Herman Road murders on December 20th of 1968, and I'm just going to be honest, it is completely possible for somebody to go from Montana to California in 3 days. There really isn't any problem with that time frame. It's just looking at what type of other evidence is there to connect him to the Zodiac case, and more importantly, can his whereabouts actually be verified in California on December 20th of 1968? Otherwise, he's just some guy who's roaming about in Montana who got out of prison. Those are the biggest questions that I had about Donald Lee Buak. And again, I didn't think much about that photo of him compared to the composite sketch, but once somebody pointed out that there are certain similarities, then I could see that. And one thing I wanted to do for this Zodiac Killer News Report is do a brief Q&A session on the suspect Donald Lee Buak, because I was just looking at some of the comments that you guys left on the old Black Box recording that came out in 2020, and I think that sometimes it's an interesting exercise to look at how things have evolved over the years, especially here on Black Box Online Radio, but just about what people are posting online maybe 3, 4 years ago. And one of the comments is actually rather new. But somebody named N0 says, I wish you'd do more videos on Donald Lee Buak. He's the only suspect that I know of that actually admitted to and was convicted of killing someone, let alone someone in law enforcement, served only 11 years for it. That's the murder of Otto Fossen, which for murder seems like he almost got away with it. Maybe making him feel like he wasn't afraid to go to the gas chamber, and the Zodiac talked about not being afraid of going to the gas chamber. He kind of got away with the murder of the deputy, escaped like he said. Can't take them too serious after that. Maybe law enforcement knew who it was and was too embarrassed to admit that they let this guy go, so they fumbled the case. I'm not too sure if he'd kill again, because he did before. I wouldn't put that past him. With all suspects, that's got to stick out more than anybody when looking at the case. Now, this whole thing, though, about Donald Lee Buak is the only suspect who has admitted to and was convicted of killing someone, I have to disagree with that. I mean, and I'm sure you can already think of some Zodiac killer suspects that are coming to mind that are convicted murderers. I mean, I was just talking to you guys about Joseph Paul Franklin, who was a real serial killer called the Racist Killer. And even if you want to get a little bit more technical, Donald Lee Buak isn't the only Zodiac killer suspect with a Deer Lodge connection. I also have a standalone episode on Frank Dryman Valentine, who was convicted for the murder of Clarence Pellet, and he served, 13 years of the life sentence, and there are a lot of long and twisted and complicated stories about Frank Dryman Valentine, but again, he was a convicted murderer, he was paroled, and then he violated his parole, and he ended up being the longest absconding fugitive in the history of Montana, but he was actually tracked down by the grandson of Clarence Pellet, Clem Pellet, and then they sent him back to Deer Lodge Prison. So, as I said, there's some very long stories, and when I did the episode on Frank Dryman Valentine, I really noticed that every single detail required like a 5-minute explanation because it's very intricate, and that's just another example of a convicted murderer. And the book that was written about him is called Dastardly by Clem Pellet. And then you have other people out there who are also convicted serial killers, and they are Zodiac killer suspects, such as BTK, Dennis Rader. He is the suspect that is discussed in the book Zodiac Settling the Score. And you also have other convicted murderers who are a little bit different, such as Bruce Davis, who was Charles Manson's right-hand man. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, is a Zodiac killer suspect that is widely discussed, and he was, of course, a convicted murderer and serial killer. So that can be a challenge question for you. Is there a serial killer that comes to mind that also is a Zodiac killer suspect? Is there another convicted murderer that comes to mind that is also a Zodiac killer suspect? But this whole thing about would he attempt murder again if he just got out of prison? Now that's recidivism, right? Some people just get out of prison and then they go right back in. I remember one year in West Virginia on the 4th of July, the fireworks were canceled in my town. And it was because there was a shooting near the park. Somebody had been out of prison for less than 6 months, and then they started shooting at somebody, and then they got sent back to prison. They were apprehended, and this is all in the papers. Some people just can't stay on the outside for very long. And the next one comes to us from Jacqueline, who says, as I have said before, if I go out of a Montana prison and it was so cold there, I would hightail it to California, celebrating my freedom. Obviously, the Zodiac was very symbolic, so it really does fit well. Really, dude, he was a freak, and his taunting trickery. Buak also liked to leave letters to the editor of his local newspaper. It really fits well. Perhaps Donald Lee Buak only did the Lake Berryessa murders. There could be multiple murders claimed by Buak. He could have done the ciphers. It will never be solved, in my opinion, with certainty. Now, you had me going there for a second, Jacqueline, first by saying that okay, this guy gets out of prison on December 18th of 1968. Yeah, it's freezing cold. So what's he going to do? Go to California where it's going to be not exactly extremely warm. I mean, From what I understand about December of 1968, when David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were murdered, is that it was actually somewhat cold. But yeah, he might have it in his mind that California is warmer than Montana, and he's going to do something like that. Yeah, that part I can follow there. Now, this thing about oh yes, yes, I do actually remember this about writing letters to the editor. And Donald Lee Buak, I believe, was even has like there's an actual article when he was talking about the movie The Exorcist, and the Zodiac would go on to write the Exorcist letter, which I will talk about later on in this episode. But I do remember that. So this thing though that I don't agree with here is perhaps Buyak only did the Lake Berryessa murders. Well, now how would that fit with the whole theory of him getting out of prison, going to California because it's warmer? I mean, how do those ideas coincide? Yes, it's feasibly possible for somebody to go to California and not murder anyone, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of the Zodiac theory. And I mean, I think that it would be much more, I guess, just conceivable if you were to accuse him of all of the Zodiac's canonical crimes. But that's just my take on the subject. And we have one from Glenn Collins who says, it's a good possibility with the stutter that when he said goodbye over the phone, he said it long to keep from stuttering. Ah, yes, and now I conclude Zodiac Monday episodes by saying goodbye. Nancy Slover talked about this, about how he spoke in a monotone. He didn't have any recognizable foreign accent, but he had a very odd way of speaking. Brian Hartnell also talked about this at Lake Berryessa. The surviving victim at Lake Berryessa said that the Zodiac had an unusual speaking cadence. And some people think that the Zodiac was doing that to cover up a stutter. And I mean, that's not impossible. There are other murderers out there who have a stutter, like Robert Christian Hansen from Alaska, the butcher baker is the first one that comes to mind, or some types of speech impediments. Even in John Douglas's psychological profile of Jack the Ripper, he expects that the Ripper had some type of speech impediment. And you can take that for what you will. But in terms of Donald Lee Buyak, I remember that Kevin Robert Brooks had made some statement about how he had a very bizarre way of talking, and his voice was affected because of certain illnesses. So sometimes it even sounded like this, and he would talk in just a very unusual way. So that is also something that could match up. And Gordon T says, did the kid that lived ever expound upon the Zodiac's voice? Donald Lee Buyak had a distinct voice that someone would have remarked about. Now, by the kid that lived, if you mean Brian Hartnell, oh yes, absolutely. He also said almost the same things that Nancy Slover did. No recognizable foreign accent. There was somewhat of a drawl, and it's just the unusual speaking cadence. My personal hypothesis on it is that the Zodiac was trying to disguise his voice, the way that somebody would do when they're playing a character, if you will. They don't want to use their own natural voice because they're just getting into character. But the thing about the stutter could be true, it's just unconfirmed. And then we have one here from I'm a Chowderhead who says, so the Deer Lodge, Montana thing is a little sketchy. I read some reports on the attack on Brian Hartnell, and after the attack, he was interviewed by Ranger White directly after the attack, and he stated that the suspect was from Colorado and not Montana. So it's hard to know the legitimacy of the Deer Lodge connection. And this is something that Drew Beeson likes to talk about a lot. Drew Beeson is the author of Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer, as well as the host of the Zodcast. And what he mentions is there is a set of dialogue in the police reports where Brian Hartnell is almost led to say the term Deer Lodge. He just remembered that it was a double name. And by double name, that there were two words in the name. The Zodiac Killer approached him in Lake Berryessa wearing the hooded costume and said that he was an escaped prisoner from Deer Lodge prison in Montana, or he killed a guard while he was escaping from prison. All I want's your money. I'm just trying to get to Mexico. And now he says, Brian Hartnell said that it was some type of double name like Fern Feathers or Fernlock, something to that effect. But there was a previous interview that was that I haven't exactly read, but it's referenced there because somebody follows it up by saying, last time I thought you said the word lodge. And then he says, yeah. And then they're saying, like, well, could it have been Deer Lodge Prison, which would have been reasonably well known because of some other events that happened. So, I mean, if you're going off the transcripts of the Lake Berryessa stabbing, I mean, you can just ignore the part about Deer Lodge because we aren't 100% sure that the Zodiac killer said that. All right, I'll just put it out there. We aren't 100% sure that the Zodiac killer actually said that he was at Deer Lodge prison. And I honestly think that the suspect, Donald Lee Buak, would be hanging by a leaf. I mean, I really think he is, because if it turns out that the Zodiac didn't say that at Lake Berryessa and he actually said something else, then this whole theory just falls apart. But that's just my take on the subject. I know there's other evidence, but those are the things that I wanted to zone in on. Now, here is something else, though, that I also want to talk about, because I was bringing up Donald Lee Buak because somebody had also remarked about him in the comments section saying that it's really quite odd that you have Donald Lee Buak as a suspect and Arthur Lee Allen as a suspect, because as you guys know with Zodiac killer suspects, a lot of them are just completely different in terms of appearance. Arthur Lee Allen was 6 feet tall. He was large. He had somewhat of a moon face, just a more rounded face than the Zodiac killer's composite sketch, balding, and the Zodiac was always seen with a full head of hair. And Donald Lee Buak is in a completely different direction. He was 5 feet 9.5 inches tall, and he looked like he was in reasonable shape, and that's what the comment was. Arthur Lee Allen is big and overweight and balding, and Donald Lee Buak is 5 feet 9.5 inches tall and in reasonable shape. These men look nothing alike, yet they are both suspects, and it really just begs the question of how and why does this all come to be? And this is one of the biggest reasons why I've had a problem with Arthur Lee Allen as a Zodiac killer suspect. I just simply thought he didn't match the physical descriptions. Now, maybe he was. It's possible there could be things that have distorted the narrative. But with Donald Lee Buak, I think he looks more like what was described by the witnesses. Mike Mageau said 5 feet 8 inches tall, maybe reddish-brown curls in the hair. That could have been him. And also, as I previously stated, he does resemble certain aspects of the Presidio Heights composite sketch, particularly in the chin area, as well as also the upper part just right under the eye sockets, I think is very similar in one of the Presidio Heights sketches. But I would just like to turn it over to you guys. What do you think about Donald Lee Buak as a Zodiac killer suspect? And I would also like to remind you that you can support this channel at BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And our first one comes to us from Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. Batman66 has also been helping out a lot with the YouTube Shorts, which are coming out 5 days a week, and they are released on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. And if you aren't following me on Facebook, my name is Ned DeHaan over there, just my name, Ned DeHaan. And on Instagram, of course, BlackBoxNed88. And you can watch shorts as reels on those two pages as well. And the next one comes to us from River Prawn Pottery. And River Prawn Pottery also left a good comment on the most recent short that came out. And this is one that I uploaded earlier today, but I have to admit when I'm wrong, and I made a slight error in that one. And this was in relation to the Lawson family murders. The Lawson family murders took place in 1929 in North Carolina, and they were committed by an individual named Charles Lawson. And River Prawn Pottery says, "Hi Ned, in the opening shot you highlighted the son of Charles Lawson. Charles Lawson is the goofy-looking guy in the back row." And I will always appreciate corrections like that, and perhaps I'll do a follow-up short as well discussing that. But the Lawson family murders were a rather bizarre crime, and once I learned that there were a bunch of rumors that happened as to why this guy Charles Lawson murdered his family, and some of the rumors might actually be credible, I just get the type of curiosity where I want to know more. It seems like an example of a story where we know who did it, but we don't know why they did it. And again, I might do a follow-up discussing that a little bit more. But with the Lawson family murders, in 1929, Charles Lawson murdered his wife and 6 of his children. He had 8 children, but 1 passed away early on in childhood. And the only person who was not murdered was his eldest son. And he sent him on an errand, meaning that he intended to keep him alive while he was murdering the family, and then he went on to commit suicide, and nobody has any idea why he did it. It could have been because he he was just dealing with the after effects of a brain injury. He had a head injury shortly before the murders, but it could also be that he had an incestuous relationship with his daughter and he got her pregnant, and he just didn't want the family to deal with the scandal. So he murdered everyone, and I don't give him any praise for that. I mean, he's trying to save himself, not the family. He would have been the one who did that in that scenario. But as I said, it's a mystery in terms of a motive. But I thank River Prawn Pottery for that comment all the same. And the next one comes to us on BuyMeACoffee.com from Classic Chevy Cat, who says, "Hi Ned, great show Monday as always. Keep doing what you're doing, as it is appreciated by many. I see you're almost to 4,000 followers. We need to have a celebration when you hit 4,000. And I'm going to talk about a celebration in just a second in a different way, maybe not exactly what people would be imagining. And the next one on BuyMeACoffee.com comes to us from Drew, who says, Happy West Virginia Day, Ned. Hey, Drew, thanks. Happy West Virginia Day to you, too. Maybe a bit belated, but thank you. And then we have one from DB Pooper, not DB Cooper, but DB Pooper, who says, Love the shows, Ned. You consistently come up with new and interesting and insightful new commentary on cases that are over 50 years old that reflect an intelligent and passionate mind. ADB, thank you so much. Much appreciated. And yes, every Friday I do a segment about DB Cooper. But this Thursday on Black Box Online Radio, there will be a special bonus episode. You can listen to the first ever Black Box Online Radio State of the Union address. And I got the idea from a channel called Playing with Fire that did the State of the Union address over there, and more or less it was just talking to the fans, trying to engage a little bit more, asking people what they wanted to hear about, and talking about the new updates for Black Box Online Radio, some future developments for the channel, expansions, as well as just hearing more about what people want to explore in the true crime world. And I will also share a lot of personal things that are going on this year for my family and me, and there'll just be a lot to discuss. So you can tune in for that on Thursday, the State of the Union address. Now, that's not quite a celebration, and I'm not at 4,000 subscribers yet, but it should be just around the corner. And thank you so much to everyone who has donated on BuyMeACoffee.com. You can also use the super thanks on YouTube, and some other great ways to help the channel are just by hitting the like button and subscribing. That really does a lot for the YouTube algorithm. And also, if you genuinely like the episode, just please feel free to give your response. But there is a lot of other Zodiac commentary that it is out there to discuss. Firstly, there is a new episode on Drew Beeson's channel where Ross Geraci of Planet X Filmworks was interviewed, and they were discussing the Gaviota Beach murders. And I am recording this one prior to the release of that episode, so I'm going to be responding to that one next week. But I did get the opportunity to watch Drew Beeson's live stream on the New York Zodiac killer copycat, Eddie Seda. Drew Beeson is the host of the Zodcast, and he puts out an episode every Sunday night, a live stream every night, Sunday night. And the Zodiac killer copycat in New York was Eddie Seda. His full name was Heriberto Seda, and he was much younger than a lot of the Zodiac killer estimations. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting is when Drew was talking about how there was a Zodiac killer copycat in the 1990s. And San Francisco almost immediately responded by saying, nope, this isn't the Zodiac of the 1960s. And Drew was just like, isn't that a premature thing to say? Now, it turned out to be correct, but a premature thing to say. If they never caught the Zodiac of the 1960s, how on earth would they know that it wasn't the same killer? Yeah, there were taunting messages that were mailed in and they looked different. Yeah, there was almost a different MO, and there's different language that is used in the letters. But how would you know with certainty that that's not the same killer? And I would side with Drew on that one. And to help us out, we're going to go over to crimelibrary.org. I'll provide a brief introduction to Eddie Seda, and then I will talk about some of Drew's observations. 22-year-old Heriberto Seda, also known as Eddie, lived with his mother and half-sister in East New York. He was clean-cut, handsome, and kept his room spotless. He didn't work, he had no friends, and he dropped out of high school at 16 after being suspended for carrying a weapon. Eddie Seda took no public assistance the way his mother did. He obtained his money by shoveling plastic bags up the return slots of payphones and vending machines. After a few days, he would return and remove the bag and take the change. Yeah, I mean, life's a different world. I mean, payphones, I guess, still exist. I just don't see a lot of people using them. And even I would try to get a quarter that was left behind sometimes, but that's hardly in the same ballpark. The long and short of this is, this guy, Eddie Seda, is 22 years old, and he goes around murdering people. And the stuff that Drew was talking about on his live stream, and I invite you to watch his whole episode, are that Eddie Seda was caught, and he openly provided a reason and explanation, and he said that it was sexual frustration. Now, there are so many people out there who think that the Zodiac killer of California was driven by sexual frustration. There's so many people out there who think that the Zodiac was somebody who was not molesting the victims, not some type of sexual torture murderer, but he still got some type of sexual arousal from the crimes, or there was a sexually linked motive to what the Zodiac was doing. And the Zodiac even talked about this in the 408 cipher that was mailed in 1969 when he said, "To kill is the most thrilling experience. It's even better than getting your rocks off with a girl." But with Eddie Seda, he is a heterosexual male, and he claimed that he was doing this because he wasn't able to find a sexual partner, but he was murdering men. So that's also something that could possibly end up in the Zodiac's ballpark. I think that the Zodiac killer was a heterosexual male who murdered men, and he murdered both men and women, but he also murdered Paul Stein, a lone male. And the Zodiac just seems like somebody who was frustrated with society, and that, I think, is the overall linking element. Now, why would this guy, who is mad that he can't be intimate with women, murder men? And that is just being mad at society, mad at the world, and just the more likely targets. An odd thing, though, about Eddie Seda is it's almost as if he planned to murder 12 people, one for each zodiac sign, and his first 3 victims all had different zodiac signs, and to this day it is a mystery as to how he was able to do that, how he was able to murder 3 people whom he didn't appear to have any real connection to, and still murder 3 people with different zodiac signs. And the theory that was put forward on an episode of Forensic Files is one that I think could be correct, and that is that he just got lucky, meaning that he would commit the murder and then he would pull out the person's wallet and look at their driver's license, and he expected that with the first 3 murders that he would be able to do that without killing somebody who was born under the same star sign. And I mean, of course, it's entirely possible that you could murder 3 people and 2 of them would both be born in June, 2 weeks apart or something like that, but that's what it seemed like the New York Zodiac was doing. I also thought it was a very insightful statement from Drew Beeson on his show when he said that Eddie Seda, the New York Zodiac copycat, seemed to resemble David Berkowitz more so than the Zodiac killer. And think about everything that I read off on this crimelibrary.org post. He is somebody who had no friends, some type of loner, sexually frustrated. David Berkowitz had no friends, loner, sexually frustrated. It's almost as if there's some type of system there, but there really is just genetics, neurological functioning, abusive childhood, and being rejected from society. When these things get put in together, then this person is more likely than not to have some type of antisocial personality issue and possibly homicidal tendencies. David Berkowitz committed murders, and he created the Son of Sam persona, and he was someone who murdered couples but again because of heterosexual frustration. And then you also have people such as E.R., the Isla Vista shooter, who committed the Santa Barbara shooting in 2014, and he just wrote an entire manifesto called My Twisted World, saying that he was going to get his day of retribution. He felt rejected from women in society, so he was going to murder people. But he was also someone who murdered men. He killed his 3 roommates who were male, which had nothing to do with being rejected by women. I mean, they were 3 males, and he stabbed the 3rd victim, George Chun, 93 times, and that just goes to show that I think that it's about power, dominance, greed, selfishness. And with ER, he's often referred to as a textbook example of sense of entitlement disorder. And with Eddie Seda, there could also be sense of entitlement disorder, with the Zodiac Killer sense of entitlement disorder. And this ties into some of the dark triad traits that the Zodiac Killer of California almost certainly had, such as being narcissistic, psychopathic, and being a Machiavellian, thinking that he is above the rules of society so he doesn't have to follow them and he can just move around them and not get caught. And that's not the perfect definition of Machiavellianism, but that's what I think the Zodiac was doing. And I would also like to talk about something else, and that is that there is a second episode on the French Wrecking Crew where Jerome Helot shares his personal theory about the Zodiac Killer. On last week's Zodiac Monday, I was talking about part one of Jerome's theory, and we've had the opportunity to bounce some ideas back and forth via these YouTube episodes, and Jerome made some direct responses to my first episode, and it relates to something that I was talking to you guys about when Jerome said that he thought that the Lake Berryessa stabbing could have been a copycat. As previously stated, the Zodiac attacked Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa the only time he wore the costume, the only time that he committed the murders by knife, and Jerome said that he thought that that could have been a copycat. Now, he thinks that the Zodiac Killer was a team of 3 people, which included Don Cheney and Sandy Panzarella. 3 people, at least 3 people. But as far as the copycat angle, again, Jerome can correct me if I misunderstood. What he meant was that it was a copycat of a previous crime, most likely the Domingos Edwards murders that were committed in Southern California. Not that it was just completely unrelated to this team of 3 individuals, which I guess would center on Don Cheney, so to speak, but that it was just so similar to the Domingos Edwards murders at Gaviota Beach that saw the deaths of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards, that it's almost as if they stole somebody's idea. And the reason why Jerome said this, I think this is another very good point, is because nothing the Zodiac Killer was really doing was original. You know, he talks about he wants to hunt people for sport because man is the most dangerous animal of all. Well, that's stolen from the most dangerous game, the story about hunting people for sport, and the things that the Zodiac has taken from comic books and movies, and even sometimes directly writing about them, such as The Exorcist or the movie Badlands. And I even talked about once when Richard Grinnell shared something from the 1971 letter saying that it's quoting it's referencing the trailer to the movie Vanishing Point. The Zodiac, or Zodiacs plural, are just stealing ideas from other sources. It's quite possible the name Zodiac was stolen from the movie Charlie Chan at Treasure Island, and there can just be countless pieces of literature, comic books, stories, and music. How about the Mikado? The Zodiac is ripping off the Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan blatantly, insanely. So I think that this ties in that the Zodiac would copycat other crimes. And this just goes to highlight something that I've been talking about for the longest time, and that is that the Zodiac is someone who was an avid true crime follower. And I'm not only saying that because I'm an avid true crime follower, I'm saying that because I think that there's just too much evidence to support it when the Zodiac is looking at all of these different similarities. And it really wouldn't be too complicated if you just have somebody who's reading the newspapers and magazines and newsletters that would have been going around at the time. And they're retaining a lot of information and it's influencing their choices. And if there are 3 people involved, that's even more. But I invite you to watch Jerome's live stream on the French Wrecking Crew. That's the name of his channel. He now has 2 episodes about his personal theory on the Zodiac Killer mystery. And you can always weigh in the comment section below if you think there was one killer or it's a team of killers. And the next thing that I would like to discuss comes to us from Chad Burke. Chad Burke is the author of several publications out there. One of them is Cracked, and the other one is There Never Was a Zodiac Key, and also he has some other things out there, such as He Who Lives by the Code Dies by the Code. But Chad Burke is perhaps more well known for being the guy who's always trying to solve the Z13 cipher, yet he is also looking at the Zodiac Killer's Exorcist letter, and Chad has proposed some suspects in the past that are very different, such as an individual named Richard Angel, as well as even entertaining the possibility that the Zodiac Killer was somebody named John Damon, that wasn't his real name. His real name was Leslie Arnold. But I will perhaps do a larger suspect profile on Leslie Arnold, John Damon in the future. But lately, it seems like he has been exploring the possibility of Donald Lee Cheney being connected to the Zodiac Killer. And when you look at the bottom of the Zodiac Killer's Exorcist letter, which was mailed in 1974, you can see that there are some very bizarre shapes, and people aren't quite sure what these mean. Some people think that it's a reference to the murder of Kim Wendy Allen, who was carrying a barrel of soy sauce when she was murdered, and that had some type of either Asian writing on it or maybe some symbols. I've sent them to people in China and they don't recognize any of the symbols, as well as possibly they could be Japanese or something, but there are symbols on the barrel and they were shared, by the media. So somebody could be, or they, even if they weren't shared by the media, if it were the real killer, they're just kind of leaving a clue that he committed the murder of Kim Wendy Allen. So I take that thing back about being shared by the media. That's almost irrelevant. I think I was remembering something else, to be honest. But more importantly, there are other theories out there, such as Kevin Robert Brooks, the guy who thought that Donald Lee Buak was the Zodiac Killer, stated that he thought the symbols could be rearranged and they could spell out the words "to kill." Then Chad Burke actually thought you can rearrange them and you get D and C and an upside down cross and, DC for Don Cheney. And this isn't just something that I'm highlighting because there are the letters D and C. Chad Burke has talked about how it could mean Don Cheney because he's also looked at other symbols, such as a bizarre marking on the car door at Lake Berryessa that almost resembles the signature of the word Don, D-O-N. And it's just some possible clues that could tie things together a bit more for Don Cheney to be the Zodiac Killer. As previously stated, he is the suspect of Drew Beeson, author of Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer, the host of the Zodcast, whom I was just talking about. And as you see, Jerome has Don Cheney in his theory as well. But what do you think about this interpretation of the symbols of the Exorcist letter DC upside down cross? Now, the Exorcist letter is going to be an important topic today because I will be looking at something that was shared to me from Jeff Thornton, also known as Thornton Daniel Jeffrey, and he is associated with ZodiacKillerBomb.com, which is run by his wife, Melissa Rose Tappa, and I've had the opportunity to interview both Jeff and Melissa, and their Zodiac Killer suspect is named Loring Dale Hill, and it relates to an interpretation of the Exorcist letter that goes back to Loring Dale Hill's military service. Loring Dale Hill was a helicopter pilot and naval aviation mechanic, and in 1969 he was deployed on the USS Enterprise. He left California on January 7th of 1969, and on January 14th of 1969 there was a vicious fire that ravaged the USS Enterprise, and I think that it's fair to say that Jeff and Melissa have centered their entire Zodiac theory. Okay, not the entire theory. I think it's fair to say that they've centered a large portion of their Zodiac theory on their suspects' time on the USS Enterprise. And this relates to other things, such as a symbol that's on the Halloween card could have been meant to draw out the shape of the USS Enterprise, as well as the timelines, leaving California on January 7th of 1969, returning on July 2nd of 1969, 2 days before the Blue Rock Springs shooting. But the Zodiac Killer is quoting a piece of the Mikado in the Exorcist letter. Whoever wrote it, even if it's not an authentic communication, a piece of the Mikado was quoted. And I believe it's the second to the last song that is performed in the Mikado, and it says he plunged himself into the billowy wave, and an echo rose from the suicide's grave, Titwillow, Titwillow, Titwillow. So, I think that the fair way to put it is, Jeff Thornton believes that it was a reference to Loring Dale Hill surviving the fire on the USS Enterprise and plunging into either the ocean or also below decks, because there were other fires that were on aircraft carriers, such as the fire on the USS Forrestal. And when these events occurred, one thing that they just had to do was start pumping seawater into the lower decks of the aircraft carrier. But if they pumped too much, then that would sink the aircraft carrier. And I think that I'm just going to get right to this because I've had the opportunity to ask Jeff this, and I said, I saw your post So did I get this straight? Your observation is that the Exorcist letter is a reference to the fire on the USS Enterprise when L.D. Hill would have had to have plunged into the water, billowy wave, suicide's grave, titwillow, titwillow, titwillow. Jeff said yes. It makes total sense. Since his squadron was right there when it happened, my guess is that he jumped in the water right before the explosion went off, otherwise it would have killed him. And then, my question, of course, was, but any idea why he would have waited 5 years to write that? Now, as stated, the fire on the USS Enterprise was in 1969. The Zodiac didn't mail the Exorcist letter until 1974. And Jeff says, no clue, not at this point. We need to get the report from the Navy on what he may have said and what they wrote. And what I said was, what do you think of the theory about the Zodiac was putting an end to the persona with the Exorcist letter? Note that it doesn't begin with a signature line, this is the Zodiac speaking, and some people believe that that's because the Zodiac wrote this when he was in prison and he was incarcerated, and one of them would be Howard Davis, author of the Zodiac-Manson connection. But then you also have other explanations, such as it was putting an end to the Zodiac's persona by saying that, the echo arose from the suicide's grave, meaning he is no longer the Zodiac. He no longer wants to identify as the Zodiac. It was a time in his life that has now been closed and it's over and done with, and this is just how he chose to end it, a send-off. And as I said, that's one of the ending numbers of the Mikado, even if it's not the final song. But I asked that question, why would he wait 5 years to compose something like that if he's referencing an event that took place in 1969? Jeff says, because he was getting out of the Navy, and I think he really had to think about some things. He planned on writing, plus he was smart, and he did write things in a timely manner. Plus, he also newer information from my mother. I personally don't remember other than him being buried in his Navy uniform. My mother said that she just remembered that per Loringdale Hill's request, based on what she said off the step grandma, is that Loringdale Hill wanted to be buried in his uniform, and a picture of the USS Enterprise put into his casket. So there is a picture of that ship in the ground with him. Now I find that odd considering that he was on multiple ships, and why he decided to pick that ship. That gets me to think that he wanted to bury the truth with him, and maybe he thought that one day, maybe someone will figure out what he did, and when they dig him up, they will find and see him with the picture. That is my interpretation of it. So as you see, Jeff is not just saying these things out there in a baseless manner. There are reasons why he believes that the Exorcist letter is a reference to the fire on the USS Enterprise, and because a lot of people are very passionate about military history, and the survivors have been interviewed at length. There have been books and documentaries that have been made about these fires on aircraft carriers, and there's actually the name Trial by Fire that is used for both the story of the USS Enterprise and the story of the USS Forrestal. And what it sounds like is that was a life-changing event for him, for Loringdale Hill, Jeff's Zodiac killer suspect, and it stood out to him in a particular way. Now, when Jeff says he wanted to be buried with the photo of the USS Enterprise, that particular aircraft carrier, that could be referring to the Zodiac killer, but it could also be referring to something that Jeff and Melissa have explored, and that is that, was Loringdale Hill responsible for the fire? Was he the person that caused the explosion? And what happened was a vehicle was parked too close to the fuel tank of one of the bombers, and that created the explosion, and then the flames went across the deck because when the jet exploded, the jet fuel more or less just spread across the deck of the aircraft carrier. So there, at the very least, this is an extremely important event in his life. If indeed their suspect, Loringdale Hill, was the Zodiac killer, there could be something to this, but it is still part of the mystery. What do you think about any of these suspects that have been discussed in this episode? You heard me talk about the composite sketches. You also heard me talk about some of the alternative theories out there, interpretations of the Exorcist letter, talking about Jerome's observations, Drew Beeson's observations, the Zodiac copycat. Share anything you want in the comment section down below. And I would also just like to know, who really do you think matches the composite sketch the most? And I didn't want to just say, oh, the suspects that I thought were the best matches, although I think Xenophon Anthony is a very strong match. I wanted to zone in on suspects who I think had a lot of similarities that don't get talked about a lot, and that was my intention with that early segment. But if you want to challenge me on any of the ideas, you can put your response in the comment section down below. And all right, that's it for me now. You can follow the show on Facebook at Ned Dahan, as well as there's a page for Black Box Online Radio. Of course, BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com, and feel free to go through some of the links in the description box. And that will be all for me. I will see you over on Ripper Wednesday, talking about Jack the Ripper. Goodbye.